You're listening to the Valley Current.
A war.
Right.
A conflict that, completely crippled the global energy market, cost thousands of lives, and effectively shut down one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet.
Yeah, the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it severely tested the limits of American military hegemony. But now, I want you to imagine all of that chaos being paused by this flimsy 60-day ceasefire document.
Mm-hmm.
A document where the two signing parties fundamentally publicly disagree on what the text even says.
Yeah, I mean, it is essentially the geopolitical equivalent of a Mexican standoff, right?
Yeah.
Two people agree to lower their guns, but neither of them actually unloads the chamber. And both are actively defining the word lowering in completely incompatible ways.
Right. So welcome to the deep dive. For you listening, if you're looking at the headlines right now, the ones shouting, peace deal in the Middle East or Hormuz reopens, consider this your masterclass in looking past the political spin.
Because there's always spin.
Always. Today, we are dissecting this brilliant, just intensely detailed game theory briefing from the Computer Law Group, LLP. It covers the events of mid-June 2026, specifically that June 13 framework agreement between the United States and Iran.
And that incredibly chaotic 48 hours that followed.
Oh, man, yeah. We are going to use the cold, unforgiving math of game theory to figure out if this 60-day window is actually the dawn of a lasting peace or just a ticking clock down to a much worse catastrophe.
Right, because when you run the actual geopolitical calculus here, what looks like a diplomatic breakthrough on paper reveals itself as, well, a structural mirage.
Mirage, yeah.
And understanding why it's a mirage requires us to strip away the rhetoric and look at the underlying incentives.
So let's just get straight into those mechanics. It's Saturday, June 13. Pakistan's Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, steps up to the microphone and announces a breakthrough.
Right, the electronic signing.
Yeah, an electronic signing within 24 hours, a 60-day ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz, which has been blocked for over 100 days, is going to reopen.
And the markets reacted immediately.
Massively. Huge sigh of relief. You see crude prices instantly react. But the briefing throws a massive bucket of cold water on this by introducing the concept of a Schelling focal point.
Yeah, Thomas Schelling's concept is absolutely vital here. To understand the fragility of this specific moment, you really have to understand the difference between a deal that resolves a conflict and a deal that merely pauses it out of exhaustion.
So the classic Schelling analogy the briefing uses is this New York City meetup. You and a stranger have to meet in New York tomorrow. No communication allowed.
Zero communication.
Where do you go and when? You both independently guess Grand Central Terminal at noon, not because you sat down and negotiated a contract, but because it's, the most salient, obvious focal point on the map.
Exactly. You gravitate toward it because you assume the other person is doing the exact same thing.
Right.
And the crucial element of that Grand Central meeting is that it is entirely unbound. There's no contract.
So enforcement.
No enforcement mechanism at all. You show up at noon, but if you get bored by 12.15 or a better opportunity arises,
you just leave.
You leave. You face absolutely no structural penalty for walking away. The equilibrium only holds as long as it's momentarily convenient for both of you to just stand there.
But wait, let me push back on that framework being applied here, because Grand Central is a low-stakes game.
Sure.
We are talking about the United States and Iran after 105 days of high-intensity kinetic warfare, a war triggered back in February by that decapitation strike on the supreme leader.
Right.
So given the economic devastation on both sides, the sheer exhaustion of military resources, isn't that mutual exhaustion enough to harden a focal point into an actual lasting peace?
You would think so.
You don't need a penalty for walking away if walking away means returning to a literal meat grinder.
It's a completely rational assumption to make, but it's mathematically incorrect in game theory. Exhaustion creates a pause, yeah, but it does not alter the underlying payoff matrix.
Okay, so what alters it?
Well, this is the core difference between a focal point and a true Nash equilibrium. In a Nash equilibrium, the architecture of the deal is self-enforcing.
Self-enforcing.
Yes. It means we've reached a state where neither the U.S. nor Iran can mathematically improve their strategic position by unilaterally breaking the agreement.
So they stay in the deal because defecting actually hurts them more than staying.
Precisely. So a Nash equilibrium is structural. A focal point is just circumstantial.
Right. And the briefing provides this rigorous two-part test to determine which one we are looking at with this June 13 framework.
Yes, the two tests.
Test number 1. Remove the external pressure holding the parties together. Does the deal survive?
And the briefing makes it explicitly clear the answer is no. Absolutely no.
Yeah, it's duct taped together.
Completely. This 60-day ceasefire is held together by the crushing weight of the U.S. naval blockade and the immediate live threat of military strikes against Iran's Karg Island oil terminal.
So if the United States were to suddenly announce, hey, we trust the framework, we are withdrawing the Fifth Fleet, good luck.
The entire agreement evaporates. The incentive to comply only exists because the guns are literally pointed at the structural vulnerabilities of the Iranian economy.
Wow. Okay, so it fails test 1 spectacularly. The enforcement is entirely external and coercive.
Yep. But test 2 is where the geopolitical danger really, really accelerates.
Okay, hit me with test 2.
Test 2 asks, is the core underlying conflict resolved and verifiably enforced?
And in this case, that means the deferred question of Iran's highly enriched uranium.
The 440-kilogram radioactive elephant in the room.
Yeah. The answer to test 2 is also a resounding no. The core issue hasn't been solved. It's been explicitly deferred to some vague future date.
Exactly. So when you combine these two failures, you realize we aren't looking at peace at all. We are looking at a highly unstable focal point being violently compressed by naval assets and economic desperation.
Okay, so if both sides know this, if the diplomats in the room know this fails the test of a lasting equilibrium and it's just a temporary pause, why are they putting pen to paper at all?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, what exactly are they buying with this 60-day window, and what are they deliberately ignoring to get the deal signed?
To understand that, we have to look at the massive disconnect between the logistical deliverables of the framework and the structural realities that it just entirely ignores.
Right, because the deal is heavily front-loaded with immediate relief.
Very heavily. Let's map out the actual table stakes.
Okay, so the Strait of Hormuz, which handles a massive percentage of global oil, is slated to reopen.
Right.
Iran agrees to a 30-day window to clear the naval mines they laid. They also agreed to allow toll-free transit for the 60-day duration of the ceasefire.
And in exchange,
the U.S. lifts its naval blockade of Iranian ports and grants a 60-day sanctions waiver, allowing Iran to physically export and sell their oil.
it's basically an exchange of immediate economic lifelines.
Yep.
But notice what is conspicuously missing from that list.
The uranium.
The defining catalyst for the entire escalating crisis. The 440 kilograms of 60% near weapons-grade uranium.
Okay, I want to stop here and really unpack the physics of this for a second, because this terminology gets thrown around in the media so casually, 60% enriched, weapons grade, downblending.
People hear 60% and they intuitively think, okay, they're a little more than halfway to a bomb.
Exactly. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how uranium enrichment actually works, isn't it?
It is the most dangerous public misunderstanding of the nuclear cycle, hands down. Uranium enrichment is not linear.
It's exponential.
It's exponential. The unit of measurement for enrichment effort is called a separative work unit, or SWU.
SWU.
Right. To take natural uranium, which is mostly U-238, and enrich it to just 5% U-235, which is what you need for a standard civilian power reactor.
That requires a massive industrial effort.
Massive. It takes thousands of centrifuges spinning constantly. Getting from 0 to 5% represents about 70% of the total physical work required to build a bomb.
Wait, really? So the heavy lifting is just getting it to the civilian level?
Exactly. Going from 5% to 20% takes another roughly 20% of the effort. But once you have a stockpile sitting at 60% enrichment,
you're basically done.
You have already expended 99% of the required separative work units to reach 90% weapons-grade material.
Okay, so 60% isn't more than halfway. 60% is essentially standing at the finish line, just waiting for the starting gun.
Functionally, yes. The breakout time, the time it would take to spin that 60% stockpile up to 90% in an underground facility like Fordo, is no longer measured in months or years.
What are we talking, weeks?
It's measured in days. Maybe weeks, depending on the centrifuge configuration, but it is fast.
Which brings us right back to the June 13 framework. Iran has 440 kilos of this material, sitting mere days away from weapons grade. And the historic peace deal addresses this existential threat by scheduling technical talks for later.
Yeah, it just pushes it entirely off the table.
Insane.
The language used is a, quote, minimum commitment to on-site dilution under supervision. But there's no timeline, no enforcement mechanism, and no mutually agreed definition of what minimum even means.
And this exposes a core game theory principle the briefing highlights, right? Issue indivisibility.
Yes, issue indivisibility.
Right, the idea that some things simply cannot be compromised on.
Yeah.
Like in business negotiations, if we disagree on a valuation, we can structure an earnout, we can split the difference. It's a divisible asset.
Exactly, you can negotiate price.
But you can't split a nuclear breakout capacity down the middle.
You cannot. A nuclear deterrent is entirely binary. You either possess the capability to ensure regime survival or you don't. For the United States and its regional allies, leaving 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium inside Iran is an unacceptable existential threat. It's an indivisible red line.
But for Iran.
For the Iranian leadership, surrendering that stockpile, especially after enduring 105 days of crippling warfare to protect it, means giving up their ultimate leverage.
Their insurance policy.
Exactly, the only true guarantor against regime change. So it is their indivisible red line.
So if you have two sides facing off over a mathematically indivisible issue where neither can logically concede, why do they sign a piece of paper on June 13? How do you get a signature when the core conflict is completely unresolved?
You get a signature because of the discount rate.
Okay, walk me through how the discount rate functions here. Because in finance, a discount rate is basically how much less you value future cash compared to cash right now. How does that translate to geopolitics?
In decision theory, a leader's discount rate determines how desperately they need an immediate win versus a long-term strategic victory. A leader with a flat discount rate is patient, right? They can endure pain now for a payoff years down the line. But a leader with a steep discount rate is desperate.
They need it today.
They value survival today so highly that they will sign a terrible deal just to make it to tomorrow.
So let's map the discount rates to the two principles here.
Historically, autocracies and democracies have highly asymmetrical discount rates. An American president in this scenario, Donald Trump, in the summer of 2026, faces an incredibly steep, unforgiving electoral clock.
The November midterms.
He is staring down the barrel of those midterms. He's presiding over a 105-day war that has failed to achieve its maximalist aims. And most importantly, he is watching global petrol prices spike.
Yeah, the briefing notes, Brent crude hit a wartime peak of $114 a barrel.
Which is staggering. The domestic political penalty for that kind of energy inflation heading into an election is catastrophic. Trump's discount rate is vertical. He needs the Strait of Hormuz open immediately.
Right. And then you look at the Iranian leadership, you'd think an autocracy doesn't have to worry about midterms, so they can play the long game.
Normally, yes. Autocrats can absorb immense civilian suffering without risking their position, which gives them a flatter discount rate.
But not this time.
Not this time. Because 105 days of a comprehensive U.S. naval blockade, combined with active kinetic strikes, pushed the Iranian economy past the point of mere suffering and into structural collapse.
The currency just free-falling.
Free fall. State revenue vanished. The regime's internal security apparatus is under immense financial strain. Their discount rate suddenly spiked to match the American timeline.
The clocks converged.
Exactly.
The American electoral clock and the Iranian economic collapse clock both struck midnight simultaneously.
Yes. They aren't signing this framework because they found a hidden compromise on the uranium. They are signing it because both leaderships realize they will not survive the summer without a 60-day injection of economic relief and political breathing room.
But the desperation to sign is so transparent when you look at how the two sides actually sold the deal to their own people. This isn't just spin, it's mutually exclusive realities.
The rhetoric completely betrays the instability of the focal point. Just look at the weekend of June 14, immediately after the announcement.
Yeah.
President Trump takes to social media. He claims the deal will result in the total, quote-unquote, elimination of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile.
Right. He talks about American forces going into the sunken granite mountains to physically extract the nuclear dust and destroy it.
And furthermore, he claims the Strait of Hormuz will be permanently toll-free.
Permanently toll-free, inside a 60-day temporary memorandum of understanding. I mean, the math doesn't even attempt to add up.
It doesn't. And simultaneously, Iranian state media is broadcasting a completely contradictory narrative to their domestic audience.
What do they say?
They are emphatically stating that the June 13 framework imposes zero new commitments on Iran's nuclear program. Zero. They insist there is no permanent alteration to their sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz. And they frame the dilution talks as a minimal, voluntary on-site procedure that doesn't strip them of their core capabilities.
It's like we just went through a massive corporate merger, and at the press conference, the CEO of Company A says they just acquired Company B in a hostile takeover.
Right.
While the CEO of Company B tells their shareholders they just bought Company A. You can only maintain that illusion until the first joint board meeting. Eventually, the structural reality has to assert itself.
And in the Middle East, you don't have to wait for a board meeting. The reality asserts itself kinetically. And it didn't even take 60 days. It took a matter of hours.
Because while Trump and the Iranian leadership are desperately trying to align their discount rates and force this bilateral piece of paper into existence, they aren't the only ones holding weapons.
No, they aren't.
What happens to the math when you realize two of the active combatants aren't even signatories to the framework?
This is the centerpiece of the geopolitical failure here. The briefing calls it the four-party trap.
The four-party trap.
And it brutally exposed the structural flaw of trying to resolve a deeply integrated, multilateral regional war with a narrow, bilateral memorandum of understanding.
Let's define this four-party trap, because the mechanics of this are fascinating and honestly terrifying. You have the United States and Iran at the top tier.
Right, they're the signatories.
They shook hands on the 60-day pause.
Yeah.
But at the bottom tier, you have Israel and Hezbollah. And they are the ones actually exchanging heavy fire over the Lebanese border.
And neither Israel nor Hezbollah signed the Geneva document.
Right.
They are completely unbound actors operating inside a conflict zone that's covered by a bilateral ceasefire.
So if I'm Israel looking at this mathematically, why would I ever abide by a U.S.-Iran ceasefire?
You wouldn't.
If the U.S. lifts the blockade and Iran gets 60 days of oil revenue, that money immediately flows to Hezbollah to rearm. From an Israeli strategic perspective, pausing the war now just guarantees they fight a better-equipped Hezbollah in 3 months.
Exactly.
The rational move is to strike now while the supply lines are degraded.
Your logic is exactly the payoff matrix Israel is operating under, and Hezbollah's matrix is the mirror image.
How so?
For Hezbollah, their core mandate is resistance. If they completely stand down just because Washington and Tehran signed a paper regarding the Strait of Hormuz, they lose their domestic legitimacy in Lebanon, and they lose their strategic utility to Iran.
So you have two heavily armed, unbound actors who both possess completely rational incentives to keep shooting.
Yes. And because the U.S. and Iran are patrons to these unbound actors, every single kinetic strike threatens the top-tier deal.
Oh, I see. Because Iran arms and directs Hezbollah and the U.S. arms and backs Israel, the actions of the proxies are immediately attributed to the principals.
Precisely. The four-party trap guarantees that any strike by an unbound party is perceived as a deliberate breach of the ceasefire by the signatory.
And we saw this play out in real time over that chaotic weekend. The exact timeline is just stunning. Saturday, Pakistan announces the electronic signing. The world markets rally.
Right.
Sunday, Israel launches a targeted airstrike deep into the southern suburbs of Beirut, a core Hezbollah stronghold. At least 3 people are killed. Almost immediately, Hezbollah retaliates by launching a swarm of attack drones into northern Israel.
The ink isn't even dry on the electronic signature, and Beirut is burning.
And look at the impossible, humiliating diplomatic contortions this forces onto the signatories. You have the President of the United States, who just staked his midterm electoral hopes on this 60-day peace window, being forced to publicly manage a treaty ally who is actively bombing the other side's proxy.
Trump literally goes on social media and orders Israel to stand down.
Yeah, he calls the Hezbollah drone attack, which, keep in mind, targeted Israeli territory, very small and meaningless.
He is publicly minimizing an attack on an ally and reprimanding that ally's military response simply to keep his bilateral deal with Tehran on life support. Let's not blow it, he posts.
It's a profound demonstration of leverage inversion. The superpower is trapped by the proxy dynamic. Trump knows that if Israel escalates in Lebanon, Iran will walk away from the Hormuz Agreement.
And Iran is playing the exact same game from the other side.
Right. The Iranian parliament speaker, Mohammad Baker Ghalibaf, publicly states that continuing the path is not possible unless there are firm commitments regarding Lebanon. Iran is suddenly retroactively insisting that the bilateral Geneva document covers all fronts.
Which is an impossible demand because the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, comes out and explicitly states the opposite.
Yeah.
He threatens that if Iran attacks Israel as retaliation for Israeli operations in Lebanon, Israel will strike Iran directly with full force. He makes it unequivocally clear to the world that Israel considers itself completely unbound by whatever arrangement Washington and Tehran reached.
It's a mediator's absolute nightmare. You have Iran claiming the deal covers everything. You have Israel stating the deal covers nothing for them. You have Hezbollah maintaining plausible deniability to keep launching rockets. And you have the United States trapped in the middle, trying to use Twitter to force an allied military to stop shooting so a geopolitical adversary will clear naval mines.
Mathematically, a bilateral focal point cannot self-enforce inside a four-party conflict. It just can't.
Right.
It requires the unbound actors to voluntarily act against their own strategic interests for the benefit of their patrons. And as we saw in Beirut, that did not happen. The framework is devoid of any structural enforcement mechanism for the Lebanese theater.
So this level of structural fragility, this immense gap between what is promised on paper and the violent reality on the ground, it naturally forces a historical comparison.
Yeah.
We've been here before with Iran's nuclear program.
Yes, we have.
And the computer law briefing doesn't shy away from it. It brings in former President Barack Obama's critique of this 2026 framework, which he delivered over that same weekend on Good Morning America.
And this is where we have to be very, very careful to maintain absolute analytical objectivity.
Oh, absolutely.
We aren't litigating the political legacies of Obama or Trump here. We are looking strictly at the arithmetic of the two diplomatic frameworks, side by side, using the exact data tables provided in the source briefing. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA versus the 2026 Memorandum of Understanding.
Right. And Obama's core argument in the interview is essentially a brutal cost-benefit analysis. He says, look at the immense price we just paid in blood and treasure over the last 105 days, and look at the flimsy, unenforceable document we got in return.
He argues it is vastly inferior to the deal the U.S. already had and threw away.
To evaluate that claim, we have to look at the mechanics of what the 2015 JCPOA actually did. It was not a treaty built on trust.
No, not at all. It was an elaborate architecture of verified mistrust.
Let's unpack the enforcement mechanisms of the 2015 deal, because I think a lot of people forget just how intrusive it was.
Yeah.
We often use analogies like putting money in escrow, but this was much more aggressive.
Very aggressive.
It was like putting your money in an escrow account. But the auditor has the right to kick down the door of your house at 3 a.m., swab your kitchen counters for trace chemical residue, and monitor every single transaction you make with tamper-proof cameras.
That's a very accurate description of the IAEA's additional protocol, which Iran was forced to implement under the JCPOA. The verification regime was completely unprecedented.
Unprecedented how?
Well, the IAEA maintained absolute continuity of knowledge. They installed tamper-evident seals on centrifuges. They had 247 remote monitoring of the facilities. They tracked the uranium from the exact moment it was mined at the mill, through the conversion process, into the centrifuge cascades, and into storage.
Wow.
If a single ounce of uranium gas was diverted to a secret military site, the continuity of knowledge would break, and the international community would know immediately.
And alongside those inspections, there were hard mathematical caps. Iran's enrichment was strictly limited to 3.67%, which is barely enough for a power plant, let alone a weapon.
Right.
Their total stockpile of this low-enriched uranium was capped at 300 kilograms. Anything produced over that limit had to be shipped out of the country.
And those restrictions were locked in for 10 to 15-year horizons, depending on the specific clause. That was the architecture of the 2015 deal. Now, contrast that with the arithmetic of the 2026 framework.
The contrast is staggering. Table 4 and Table 6 in the briefing lay this out row by row. Under the 2026 MOU, Iran retains roughly 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium.
Yep.
There is no hard cap specified for future enrichment, just a vague, unenforceable reaffirmation that they won't build a weapon.
The disposal of that massive stockpile is explicitly deferred. But even more critically, the IAEA's continuity of knowledge has been completely shattered.
Because of the war.
Yes. During the 105 days of the war, the cameras were blind. The inspectors were out. We have absolutely no verifiable data on what the Iranian nuclear establishment did, moved, or hid during that time. The baseline for verification is just gone.
We were essentially taking their word for it in the dark.
Yes.
Right.
And whereas the JCPOA operated on decade-long timelines, the 2026 framework expires in 60 days.
And what was the price paid for this vastly inferior 60-day sticky note? 105 days of direct warfare. Thousands of casualties.
Yeah, economic fallout.
Right. A global energy crisis triggered by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh.
The briefing notes the World Bank cut its global growth forecast to 2.5%, explicitly citing the blockade as the cause.
The economic damage was catastrophic, not just to the combatants, but to the global south and the broader international system.
So purely on the arithmetic, Obama's critique holds up. The United States abandoned a heavily enforced 15-year cap on 3.67% uranium in 2018 without firing a shot, only to wage a globally devastating 105-day war in 2026 that resulted in Iran holding 440 kilos of 60% uranium with no inspectors.
It looks like a masterclass in strategic failure.
But the briefing is meticulous about presenting the counterargument. The game theory analysis demands balance, because the 2015 deal had a fatal structural flaw of its own, didn't it?
It did. And the defenders of the decision to abandon the JCPOA point directly to this flaw. For all its intrusive inspections and tamper-proof seals, the 2015 deal was not a true self-enforcing Nash equilibrium either.
How so? If it had all those penalties and inspections, wasn't it structurally sound?
It was technically sound, but politically entirely reliant on the domestic goodwill of the capitals involved. A Nash equilibrium endures regardless of who is in power because the math forces compliance. But the JCPOA collapsed in 2018 the moment the domestic political alignment in Washington changed.
Wow.
When the first Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal and reimposed crushing secondary sanctions, the architecture shattered.
Which proves the deal was vulnerable. It was a highly elaborate 15-year focal point that only lasted 3 years.
Exactly. The counter-argument is that the JCPOA was a flawed instrument that merely delayed an inevitable confrontation while allowing Iran to integrate into the global economy.
Okay, fair.
However, from an analytical standpoint, even accepting that critique of the 2015 deal, the conclusion regarding 2026 remains grim. The 105-day war brought a significantly costlier path to an exponentially thinner, more dangerous arrangement.
Okay, let's pull the lens all the way back. I want to look at the macro historical picture here, because there is a deeper, more unsettling narrative running underneath all these uranium percentages and ceasefire timelines. We are talking about the United States of America, the sole global superpower. They spent 105 days utilizing immense military capital against a regional power. They caused global economic panic, and the absolute best outcome they could forcefully engineer was a 60-day pause mediated by third parties. They couldn't unilaterally force the Strait of Hormuz open. They had to rely on Pakistan and Qatar to broker the handshake.
It's quite a visual.
Does this conflict mark the end of American superpower status? Are we looking at the collapse of hegemony?
That is the central geopolitical question of the briefing's fifth section, and the analysis provided is remarkably calibrated. It avoids hyperbolic declarations of imperial collapse. It doesn't say American hegemony is over.
What does it say?
Instead, it identifies this moment as a hegemonic inflection point, and the historical analogy they use is incredibly precise. They call the 105-day war Suez adjacent.
Suez adjacent. Okay, we need to dive deep into this. For those who aren't military historians, let's unpack the 1956 Suez crisis, because understanding Suez is the key to understanding Hormuz in 2026.
The 1956 Suez crisis is widely regarded as the definitive death knell of the British and French empires as independent global hegemons. Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel secretly colluded to invade Egypt and take it back by force. Militarily, the operation was largely successful. They defeated the Egyptian forces.
But geopolitically, it was a disaster.
An unmitigated disaster. Because the United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious that his allies launched a neo-colonial war without his permission. So he decided to stop them.
Not with troops, right?
Not with troops, but with pure economic hegemony. Eisenhower threatened to sell off U.S. reserves of the British pound, which would have collapsed the British currency and destroyed their economy.
Wow.
Britain and France were humiliated. They were forced to halt their military operation and withdraw, completely dictated to by Washington.
It was the moment the world watched the old empires realize they could no longer project power in the Middle East without the explicit permission and backing of the United States. The illusion of their supremacy was shattered.
Exactly. The capability was exposed as hollow. The computer law briefing argues that the 105-day war in 2026 serves a similar function for the United States.
That's a huge claim.
It is a highly visible, globally broadcast exposure of the limits of American coercive power. It's not a collapse, but it is a massive, undeniable dent in the armor.
Let's break down the ledger of this inflection point. What are the specific dents to American hegemony that the world just witnessed?
The first, and perhaps most glaring, is the loss of diplomatic centrality and convening power. For the last 50 years, when a crisis erupted in the Middle East, the road to peace ran directly through Washington.
Camp David, Oslo.
Dayton. The U.S. dictated the terms of the regional architecture. But in 2026, Washington found itself incapable of forcing a resolution. They had to outsource the mediation of a war they were actively fighting to Islamabad and Doha. Pakistan and Qatar had to construct the off-ramp for the superpower.
That is a stunning visual for the rest of the world. Beijing and Moscow are absolutely taking notes on that loss of centrality. What about the military dent?
The military dent is equally profound. The U.S. military remains the most technologically advanced, dominant, conventional fighting force in human history. Yet, it proved fundamentally incapable of achieving its strategic objectives through sheer tonnage of munitions.
They couldn't hit the underground facilities.
Right. It could not eliminate Iran's deeply buried nuclear infrastructure outright. And, crucially, the U.S. Navy could not unilaterally guarantee the freedom of navigation through a vital geographic choke point.
This is the asymmetrical warfare problem we kept seeing. We saw U.S. Apache helicopters getting shot down. We saw the Fifth Fleet struggling to safely clear cheap naval mines while under threat from swarming drones and anti-ship ballistic missiles.
It changes the math completely.
The lesson here isn't that Iran has a stronger navy than the U.S. The lesson is that a regional power with cheap asymmetrical technology can effectively deny a localized zone of control to a superpower, and the superpower cannot bomb its way out of that reality.
Denying space is vastly cheaper and easier than controlling space, and the U.S. failed to reestablish control. And beneath the military and diplomatic dents, there is a quieter, compounding structural dent: the erosion of dollar primacy.
Oh, the briefing provides a really stark statistic on this. It notes that the U.S. dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has steadily fallen. Back in 2001, it was around 72%. By mid-2026, the briefing places it at 56%.
That is the foundation of American hegemony. The ability to weaponize the global financial system relies entirely on the world's dependence on the dollar. When that dependence erodes, the coercive power of sanctions erodes with it.
And the war sped that up.
The 105-day war accelerated the urgency for nations, not just adversaries, but neutral states, to build non-dollar workarounds to insulate themselves from Washington's financial blast radius.
So we have diminished diplomatic centrality, the exposed limits of conventional military power against asymmetrical threats, and the slow bleed of dollar dominance. It looks incredibly grim.
It does.
But the briefing doesn't say hegemony is dead. It balances these dents against what it calls the intact core of American power, what remains robust.
The intact core is highly resilient. First, the United States enjoys profound structural energy insulation. This is a massive shift from the 1970s. Because of domestic shale production and a diversified energy grid, only a tiny fraction of U.S. crude consumption actually physically transits the Strait of Hormuz.
So while Europe and Asia are facing an existential lights-out supply shock when Hormuz closes, the U.S. is physically fine.
Physically, yes.
We feel the price shock at the pump because oil is a global market, but the actual barrels are still flowing in Texas and North Dakota.
Exactly. The U.S. can endure a blockade of Hormuz far longer than its allies or its adversaries. Secondly, despite the erosion of dollar primacy to 56%, the sanctions weapon is still overwhelmingly potent. We know this because Iran's economy is in systemic collapse.
So the siege works.
The financial siege works. The sheer size and depth of U.S. capital markets mean that even if you want to trade outside the dollar, doing so at scale remains incredibly costly, inefficient, and dangerous.
So the ledger is balanced, but shifting. The Roman Empire isn't falling today, but the walls are undeniably thinner, and everyone in the region knows it.
Exactly.
When you look at this entire landscape, the ruined economies, the thousands dead, the global inflation, the shifting geopolitical order, and the fact that they ended up with a flimsy 60-day pause that solves nothing, it is so incredibly easy to look at the board and conclude that everyone simply failed. Every single leader made catastrophic, irrational decisions. But game theory pushes back on that moral judgment, doesn't it?
It does. And this is perhaps the most intellectually challenging part of the entire briefing. Section 6 directly addresses the human impulse to conflate a moral tragedy with strategic irrationality.
How so?
It does this by analyzing a New York Times column written by Thomas L. Friedman, published concurrently with the June 13 framework.
Friedman's piece has a blunt, powerful title: "Everybody is a loser in this Mideast war." And his argument is essentially a comprehensive moral audit of the leadership involved.
Yes. Friedman takes all 5 principal leaders, the U.S. under Trump, Israel under Netanyahu, Iran under Khamenei, Hamas under Sinwar, and Hezbollah under Nasrallah, and argues that they all fundamentally failed their people in pursuit of unachievable fantasies.
Let's map out Friedman's audit. He argues Hamas pursued the fantasy of annihilating Israel, and the result was the utter devastation of Gaza. Netanyahu pursued a fantasy of absolute maximalist military victory, and the result was the global delegitimization of Israel and a prolonged, unwinnable quagmire.
Right.
Hezbollah dragged the Lebanese people into a ruinous war solely for Iran's strategic benefit. Iran kept the region burning to avoid domestic accountability, and Trump initiated a kinetic war to topple the Iranian regime from the air, failed, and is now signing a deal that guarantees that regime's survival just to lower gas prices before an election.
From a moral and humanitarian perspective, Friedman's case is ironclad. They all brought catastrophe to their respective populations.
Yeah.
Friedman's conclusion is that the only hope for the region is that the shared, unbearable pain of this war forces a ceasefire, which then allows the traumatized populations to finally hold these disastrous leaders accountable.
But the Computer Law Group briefing ruthlessly dissects this conclusion. It separates the moral failure from the game theory equilibrium. The briefing argues that conflating moral catastrophe with strategic instability is a dangerous analytical trap.
It is the difference between a moral lens and an equilibrium map. Friedman is asking the moral question, did this leader serve his people? The answer is universally no. They failed. But the game theorist asks a completely different question. Will this leader change his move?
And the terrifying answer is no, they won't.
Because catastrophe does not equal instability. You can preside over a completely ruined country, but if changing your strategy guarantees your immediate removal from power or death, you will rationally choose to maintain the ruin.
This is the poker analogy from the briefing. Imagine you are sitting at a high-stakes table at 4 a.m. You have played atrociously all night. You have lost your savings, your children's college fund, everything.
A total disaster.
Morally, objectively, to anyone watching, you are a massive loser. You failed your family. But if the rules of this specific underground game dictate that folding your hand means the mob takes the deed to your house and breaks your legs,
you do not fold.
You stayed at the table. You are rationally stuck in a catastrophic situation because every available alternative is worse for your personal survival.
That is the precise dynamic governing the autocracies and unbound actors in this conflict. Why did this war linger for 105 days despite the obvious economic destruction? Because for the autocrat, the war provides a shield against domestic accountability.
Right. If the supreme leader of Iran signs a comprehensive lasting peace deal, the state of emergency ends. And the moment the state of emergency ends, he has to look a devastated, impoverished populace in the eye and explain what the billions of dollars spent on the nuclear program and the proxy network actually bought them.
The reckoning. By keeping the war simmering, or by agreeing only to a 60-day fragile pause where the threat of U.S. strikes remains imminent, the autocrat defers the reckoning.
Wow.
Shared pain does not inherently drive convergence toward peace. It often drives convergence toward a managed state of permanent emergency. Friedman's hope that peace will bring popular accountability is exactly why the leaders feel peace more than they fear a managed war.
Furthermore, the briefing points out that Friedman's everybody lost framework flattens out a massive, crucial asymmetry. It makes it sound like everyone is equally weak and equally motivated to compromise. Yeah. But the equilibrium map tells a very different story about who actually holds leverage.
Exactly. When you look at the board objectively, Hamas and Hezbollah are strategically spent or severely degraded. They suffered massive kinetic losses.
But Israel isn't.
But Israel is an unbound spoiler. They may have lost moral standing globally, but they retain total air supremacy and the freedom to strike at will across multiple theaters. And Iran and the U.S., despite the economic dents and the hegemonic erosion, still retain the core load-bearing leverage of the entire region. They hold the blockade, the uranium, and the ballistic missiles.
The moral verdict tells you who deserves to fail in the eyes of history. Yeah. But the equilibrium map is what predicts what is actually going to happen when the sun comes up on day 61. You can be entirely morally bankrupt and strategically, mathematically stable at the exact same time.
Which is the most sobering takeaway of the entire analysis. We are relying on leaders trapped in catastrophic equilibriums to voluntarily negotiate their way out of them when the math dictates they should do the exact opposite.
Okay, let's unpack that terrifying thought, day 61. As we wrap up this incredibly heavy deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a specific piece of data from the briefing to mull over as you look at the news over the next few weeks. The briefing highlights the betting data from Polymarket. the prediction market platform, taken right around the time of this June 13 framework.
Prediction markets are fascinating because they aggregate the financial stakes of the crowd. They strip away the wishful thinking.
Exactly, and the gap in the data here is everything. In mid-June, the polymarket odds priced in a 70% chance that a permanent peace deal would be signed by year-end. 70%. The crowd overwhelmingly believes the politicians will find a way to sign a piece of paper because the political cost of failing before the midterms is too high.
But look at the corresponding contract. The odds that physical maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz will actually return to normal pre-war baseline levels by the end of June. That contract was sitting at a dismal 19%.
The market believes the ink will dry on the memorandum, but they fundamentally doubt the physical reality on the water. They know that a signature doesn't magically clear complex naval minefields, especially when Hezbollah and Israel are still shooting. They know the insurance premiums for oil tankers won't drop just because a politician tweeted that the strait is permanently toll-free.
The crowd is brilliantly pricing in a Schelling focal point. They believe in the temporary pause. They assign almost no probability to its structural permanence. They know it is not a Nash equilibrium.
So here's the question you need to keep in the back of your mind. What happens when the 60-day clock runs out? If that window expires and those deferred, vaguely defined technical talks haven't miraculously solved the mathematically indivisible problem of 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium,
Which they won't.
if the IAEA inspectors haven't been allowed back into Fordo to verify the dilution and reestablish continuity of knowledge, the cliff returns. The economic waiver allowing Iran to sell oil expires. The U.S. Navy blockade can instantly snap back into place.
The external pressure holding the focal point together dissolves, and the underlying conflict resumes exactly where it left off, but with less time and higher stakes.
And if that 60-day clock started on June 15th, day 61 lands squarely in the middle of August. Right as the American political machine shifts into absolute overdrive for the November midterm elections, the pressure cooker doesn't lose steam over these 60 days. It just gets a tighter, heavier lid bolted onto it for 2 months while the heat is left on high.
It is the definitive example of kicking a highly radioactive can down a very short road.
We started this deep dive talking about blueprints and architecture. The desire for a peace deal to be a solid, engineered structure with poured concrete. But as the Computer Law Group briefing so ruthlessly exposes, this June 13 framework isn't a blueprint for a house. It is a group of exhausted, desperate actors deciding to lean against each other in the dark, armed to the teeth, hoping nobody flinches, while a 60-day timer ticks down in the background. It is a brilliant, utterly terrifying masterclass in game theory, playing out with millions of real lives hanging in the balance. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense journey through the geopolitical looking glass.
Thanks for having me.
Led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at dak@computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we refer to is published in detail and readily available commitment-free with no paywalls or other charges.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.